Good evening to everyone and welcome to this evening's Local History Spotlight. The topic this evening is Oshawa in the Roaring Twenties. I am Nicole Adams. I'm the Local History and Genealogy Librarian here at the Oshawa Public Libraries, and I'll be speaking to you today on this topic. As I mentioned, I'm recording this session, and if there's any questions, we will hold those till the end. So this year marks the 100th anniversary of Oshawa's Lakeview Park, and in celebration of that, we were asked to sort of come up with an idea of programs we could feature that would sort of blend in with that theme of this year's Doors Open Oshawa, which happens at the end of this month. Now, because we're in COVID times, we can't open to the public, so a lot of us were doing programs around taking a glimpse into Oshawa's history, but not being able to visit the buildings necessarily. So I decided, because Oshawa's Lakeview Park is 100 years old this year, and the 1920s were a very interesting decade for our city and many other cities, I would focus on Oshawa in the Roaring Twenties. So now I will also note that because Lakeview Park is the 100th anniversary, Oshawa's Museum has done an excellent job of documenting the history of Lakeview Park recently in the last few months on their blog and on their website, and they recently presented it at their Oshawa Historical Society meeting. So I'm not going to focus on the history of Lakeview Park. I mentioned it just now, and I have a few photographs of the park itself, but I'm not going to be focusing on that. So the Oshawa Museum's blog is listed there if anyone's interested. I can send that out in the email once we're done the program, or I can share it in the chat box later on if you'd like. So the Oshawa Museum, as I said, has done a really good job of this, and I only have an hour to speak, so to talk about the history of Lakeview Park would take up a significant amount of that time. So we're going to not focus on that. Now, this is by no means a comprehensive study of the city of Oshawa. It is sort of a snapshot view of a couple of things that really stood out to me in the history of Oshawa in the decade of the 1920s. Now, first and foremost, the most important thing that happened to Oshawa in the 1920s was that in 1924, we became the 25th city in Ontario. And so there was a big celebration. Of course, you can see the paper here. On March 8th, 1924, we became Ontario's 25th city. There were a number of events that happened on that particular day. It was, there were parades and bands and lots of music, an all-day event that were happening at various places around the city, the new city as it is. We were, of course, a town before that for many years, and before that a village. And we've grown up over the last 150 years. So the Ontario, really, we're focusing on it. We're the industrial center of Ontario, and we've often been called the Manchester of Canada. And I once had someone say to me, well, what exactly does that mean? And if you're not familiar, Manchester, England is the industrial center of the world, really, at the time, from the Industrial Revolution and forward into the 1800s and 1900s. Lots of factories. And so when we were called the Manchester of Canada in various times, that's referring to all of the different factories that existed in Oshawa well before the 1920s. But a lot of them came into their own and expanded or grew and took on new product lines, much as the Carriage factory of General Motors. It was the McLaughlin Carriage factory and became General Motors of Canada just shortly before the 1920s started. So these are some of the factories that existed in Oshawa that employed so many people in the city. And because of this, there was lots of money to be had. The city was always encouraging different developers to build factories in their city. And that's an early on, even back into the 1870s, encouraging factories to settle in this area. And that came forward into the 1920s, where factories were, again, expanding. So what does the Oshawa of the 1920s look like? Well, because we became a city in 1924, I thought I would focus a little bit on, if I go back one slide, when we became a city, something from the Ontario Reformer at the time was sort of a really great outline of why the city, why we became a city at that time. So I'll quote from the Ontario Reformer: "Oshawa's march of progress took a decisive step forward at noon today, March 8th, 1924, when the blowing of whistles, the ringing of bells, and the firing of 25-gun salute saw the dawn of a new era for Oshawa's greatest industrial center, as it became Oshawa's newest city. Now, the growth of the community was so steady and constant that at first it came as somewhat of a surprise to the public, the citizens of this city, to know that Oshawa takes a very high place among the cities of the Dominion, meaning Canada, in such matters as building returns, customs collections, industrial payroll, and other trade barometers. This is, again, a quote from the Ontario Reformer of the time. Oshawa has an industrial payroll in excess of $7 million per annum, or almost $140,000 per week. And this is in 1924, so that's significant. Now, what this means is distributed amongst the population of 15,000 people, which is the population of Oshawa at the time. This meant that lots of different companies would wanting to settle in this area, their factories and their businesses, because they knew there was lots of money to be had and the economy was booming. Now, from the manufacturing standpoint, such firms as I mentioned, General Motors, Ontario Malleable Iron, Peddlers, Fittings, Robson Leather, W.E. Phillips became household names throughout Canada. And it's largely due to their energy, foresight, and good business sense that Oshawa became a city in 1924. Now, of course, the elephant in any room when talking about the history of Oshawa, specifically in the 1920s as well, is of course General Motors. I believe that we are the city we are today because of the strength of the General Motors factory and the fact that R.S. McLaughlin, well, actually his father, Robert McLaughlin, brought the Carriage factory to Oshawa in the 1870s from Enniskillen, where it first began, and it was the McLaughlin Carriage Company. And it began in that time. 1879, McLaughlin Carriage Company moves to Oshawa. It existed before that in Enniskillen. Then in 1907, it became the McLaughlin Motor Car Company of Canada, or McLaughlin Motor Car Company. And that was the encouragement of R.S. McLaughlin, Sam McLaughlin, who encouraged his father to start transitioning from the carriages into the new automobiles that he was seeing happening in the American market south of the border. And then later in 1918, the McLaughlin Carriage Company sold its interest and merged with General Motors, which was out of Detroit, and formed General Motors of Canada. And that, again, was the foresight of Robert McLaughlin, R.S. McLaughlin rather, who had significant partnerships set up. He didn't know how to make vehicles, but he knew people in the States that did. And he partnered with them to make Buicks here, to make Cadillacs here. We were making so many cars here that were with American parts, but on Canadian soil with Canadian workers. So this was a really significant leap forward for Oshawa. And in the 1920s, shortly after the formation of General Motors of Canada, you see exponential growth with this company. It's also to be noted that General Motors, when it was the carriage factory, suffered a significant fire in 1899 and could have just left Oshawa altogether. But shortly after that, they moved temporarily to Gananoque and had a factory there while they were rebuilding here in Oshawa based on money that they were given by the city of Oshawa to keep them in town. And I think that was a really important point to note with the city of Oshawa's governance at the time. They knew that this was a major linchpin in their success as a community, and they gave them money to build a new factory, to forward them that money. And then General Motors, of course, paid it back many times over. Now, for a detailed overview of General Motors in the city and the Oshawa's automotive community, you might like to take a look at the Oshawa's Canadian Automotive Museum here in Oshawa, which has an exhibit. It's open now, the museum, and it has an exhibit called Oshawa's Automotive Community, which is excellent. And they've done a lot of research using materials from various archives, libraries, and the gallery here in Oshawa, photographs, and lots of literature from General Motors at the time. So you might want to check that out. I'm not going to go into too much more detail about that. Now, of course, with all of this prosperity comes, the prosperity wasn't trickling down to the workers, and therefore the workers at the time in the 1920s, specifically leading up to 1928, were very dissatisfied with the fact that they didn't have they weren't making a decent wage to meet the cost of living at the time. Now, during the war, the First World War, they voluntarily took pay cuts to help get through the wartime. But their pay wasn't raised significantly enough after the war. Even when the business was booming in General Motors, they didn't get the money trickled down to them in any way significantly to be able to afford living in the city. So seeking better wages and better working hours, they were looking for a 40-hour work week. And because of this, they went on strike in March of 1928. It was a 4-day strike, and multiple meetings happened over a period of 4 days, after which they did form a union and became part of the, the International Automobile Industrial Workers Union. Now, this strike lasted 4 days, but this wasn't the last strike to take place in Oshawa at the General Motors plant, as a much larger and more significant strike occurred just 9 years later in 1937. So the strike was over. This is the headline from the day, March 30th, where they resolved the issue with the striking. Now, all of these materials that I'm using are either from the Oshawa Library's collection or the Oshawa Museum, which is at the Lakeview Park area, Oshawa Museum and Archive down there, or the Robert McLaughlin Gallery has a collection of Thomas Boakley photographs. So I've cited the photographs where I've taken them from somewhere else, and the newspapers come either from our microfilm collection, which people can research here at the library or request that we look things up for them, or the museum also has digitized some of these early papers on the Oshawa Museum's website. So if you're looking to explore some of the city's history, it's a great place to sort of look online now that we're all kind of sequestered inside and not coming out as often as we'd like to visit. We'd like to see people using those resources. Now, Peddler People is another factory that was a major employer in the 1920s. Now, this is a photograph from about 1914, and the original Peddler location, or at least not the original one, but the large one, was located at Memorial Park site. And up until 1920, that's where it was. And then they left in 1920 to move to a much larger factory on Simcoe Street South, which is where it was until the late 70s, I believe, when it was torn down to make a plaza down there on Simcoe Street South, just north of the 401. But again, they expanded just before right around the 1920s because of the success of the Peddler People's metal products. They were well known worldwide as the Commonwealth's #1 supplier of metal built products. Now, this is Peddler People in 1920. This is Simcoe Street South. It's an artist's rendition of Peddler People at the time in 1920. And there are more recent photographs you can find of this because it existed into the 1970s, but it was a very significant, if anyone's from Oshawa area, that was a very imposing building on the south Simcoe Street. Now, I mentioned the Memorial Park and the site of the original Peddler plant where I showed you the postcard just 2 slides ago. After they picked up and moved to their new factory, of course, the other factory on Memorial Park site was demolished. It wasn't known as a park then, of course, it was the Peddler plant. And you can see here where the ground is all dug up, and the city had purchased the land and was going to be making it into a central park. And in the background, you can see on the right-hand side is the old St. George's Anglican Church, which shortly after this, in 1922, moved up to new site just north of there on Center Street. Now, this is looking towards Center Street, so the church on the left, my left, and on the right is the Center Street School, which was torn down shortly after this to be replaced in 1923. So this is image courtesy of the Thomas Boakley collection, and they have, like I say, a lot of multiple thousands of photographs that you can consult on the history of Oshawa. Now, on that site, Memorial Park, called the Garden of the Young Forgotten, the cenotaph bearing the names of fallen soldiers was installed there in 1924, with much ceremony. There was a movement around the Commonwealth to raise funds to build memorials like this all over, and Oshawa was no different. A committee was formed, and the land was given by the city or sorry, it was already acquired by the city and was developed over a period of a couple of years. This is actually modeled after a memorial in Evesham, England, and the sculptor who did the sculpture on the top here was from England as well. Now, of course, this was first established in 1924, and then during World War II, after that, they had another plaque listing the names of the fallen soldiers from that conflict as well. Now, another factory that a lot of people might be familiar with is the fittings factory, which, pardon me, which a lot of these are artist renditions of the factories at the time. And I've lost my, here we go. So both malleable iron and fittings had a similar owner, they had the same owner or a part owner, and they would build housing for their workers nearby. And in the case of fittings, they built a location called Storyville, just in the Albert and Stacy Streets area. So they built these houses to make sure the workers were closer to the factory. And what they would do is they'd build the houses, and they would lease them or rent them to their employees for a subsidized rate. And these houses are still in that area today. You could call them the wartime housing. Now, malleable iron did something similar. Now, malleable iron is actually located on what they call Front Street, which used to be Prospect Street. It is now the site of where the old Nob Hill Farms was, and some of the building, part of the building is still there. And like fittings, Malleable also built houses for their workers nearby. This is the Williams Carriage Factory, Williams Piano Factory, which was on William Street. And this building originally was the A.S. Whiting Manufacturing Company, but in the 1920s, it was the Williams Piano Factory, and approximately 250 men were employed here during its heyday. The building is no longer there, of course. It is the site of the Durham Region Police Station near the far end on the left. And the W.E. Phillips Company, which commenced operations in 1922 with a specific focus on manufacturing glass moldings. And the company produced decorative objects and picture frames, as well as automotive items such as windshields. And you can see a lot of times in these older photographs, you can get a picture of the factory. There's a group of employees standing out front, showing the size of the employee base at the time in front of their new factory. Now, with all of these factories, what drew them to Oshawa as well was the fact that the Oshawa Railway would tie the factories to the lake where they could get shipments of their raw materials coming in through the port. And so the Oshawa Railway had both street railway for citizens as well as freight railway. And you can see all these little turnoffs and spurs that led to the different factories in the downtown area, because most of the factories were within a very close area of probably a 10 or 12 block radius in that area. The North GM plant, of course, Fittings, which is on Bruce Street or was on Bruce Street. It's now an empty lot at this point, just south of the current arena. And you have the Williams Piano Factory, which was also had a spur leading to it as well. And it connected up with the other railways going north. This is actually an east, I've turned the map on its side so you can see the whole map in a larger view. The Oshawa Creek along the top here. So we're kind of looking at it from its side rather than looking from north to south. We're looking east to west here. And this is an example of a street railway car parked on Simcoe Street. just in front of what was the original Carnegie Library, the original library before we built this McLaughlin branch that I'm sitting in. So that library is no longer in existence, but it was there in 1924, sorry, 1922 when this picture was taken. That library was replaced by this one in 1954 and torn down around 1956. You can see a church in the background on the left, which is Simcoe Street United, which is still there. And the top of the Manse house, which is next to it, are both still there. Simcoe Street United is undergoing a lot of renovations at the moment. And it is the oldest church in Oshawa, built in 1864 or 63. I forget the year. I don't have it in my notes. Now, telephone service in Oshawa existed at the time, and these are telephone operators in 1922. And phone service was established in Oshawa in around the 1880s. By 1920s, over 2,400 telephones were in the city. And of course, these were mainly what they call party lines, unless you had a business line. And so businesses often would advertise their phone number. And the phone numbers in the beginning stages were very short numbers, 3 or 4 digit numbers. And then once more and more telephones came on the system, they had what they called an exchange system. So in Oshawa, our exchange was known as Randolph. So as an example, in 1950, my grandfather got a phone number called Randolph 7052. And he still has that same number, but they replaced the Randolph with 725, 7052, and he still has that number today. So the exchanges just grew, and but they were party lines early on, which meant if anyone has lived rurally, I grew up in the East Coast, and we had party lines you could pick up, and you had different rings for each household. So you knew which ring was yours and when to pick up. This was the case in the party line. And of course, there were operators that were managing those lines as well. So you could pick up your phone and dial the operator, and she would dial and connect you with the party you were looking for. And the operators were all women as well, significantly, just solely women. Now, newspapers of the time, this is a picture of Ontario Reformer paper boys at the time in 1926. Right around the time the Reformer, just before the Reformer became the Oshawa Daily Times. So you can see the bags that they're wearing say Reformer. So they were, I think there were 26 of them in total at this time, delivering papers 6 days a week. Now, the papers of the time, early on, there was the Oshawa Telegram, which was a standalone paper, and then the Ontario Reformer in the early 1920s. And at the time, in 1926, you'll notice in the middle there, the Oshawa Junior Reformer, they published, it was just a single or 2-sheet paper, the Oshawa Junior Reformer, just for young readers. So there were stories about who'd done well in class and who succeeded, you know, which team won the game on the weekend, and stories from books from the library that they might like to check out. And there were no pictures in any of these, and only 6 that I know of survive. In 1926, they ran from January to June, and I didn't find any more, but it's possible that those have not been filmed or scanned. And then the Oshawa Daily Times, which you can notice the subtitle here saying succeeding the Oshawa Daily Reformer. So that's what it became, the new name of the paper in 1927. And the Oshawa Times was then truncated to the Oshawa Times, which survived into the 1990s when it closed after a fire. Actually, there was a fire there in the 70s, and it then closed in 1994. Now, banks in the city, you can always tell the wealth of a city by the number of banks that it has. In the city at the time, I think this was in 1925, there was the Bank of Commerce, the Dominion Bank, the Standard Bank, the Royal Bank, and the Union Bank. And you'll notice that some of these banks still exist today. The Dominion being the Toronto Dominion now, the Bank of Commerce, of course, and Royal Bank. And Union Bank and Standard are no longer under those names and having merged and become other entities. Now, some views of the city at the time. Now, some of these photographs will show, you can see the cars on the left driving down that we're looking towards in this photograph. We're sitting on King Street East, looking towards the west. On our right is the Regent Theater, the old post office next to it, and further down the street, there's Carnes Drugs and Lovell Drugs, and further down, you can't really make out what the businesses are. So this is a photograph from the Thomas Boakley collection at the Robert McLaughlin Gallery in 1924. Now, you notice on that tower as well, this is a view looking the other way. And on the tower, the post office had a large clock, so people could always tell what time it was if their wristwatch had stopped. This is kind of taken from a building across the street, so it's at a weird angle. And you can see clearly in the middle foreground Carnes Drugs, as well as this other building, which is no longer there. On the corner, and they'd widened the street where the cars are coming out. That street is now wider. That is Victoria Street, which is no longer there. Well, it's no longer a through traffic street is what I mean. And the post office as well was torn down in 1950s. This is King Street looking further east. So we're right in this far left, we can see the corner of the Regent Theater. This is looking east. And in the distance on the left, you can see the General Motors of Canada hovering over everything in the background. And you notice here in this photo in 1924, this corner that we're looking at with these two houses in the middle are now occupied by the Genash Hotel, which wasn't built until later in this decade. Further down the street, across from where the currently there is a parking garage, is another house. Later, after this house was torn down, Ontario Motor Sales was on this site for a number of years. So that kind of shows you as well. You see the cars here, but also the railway tracks going down the middle of King Street, which were there until 1960. It was 1963 when they were pulled out. You'll notice that a lot of the photographs that exist from this time are only in the downtown area, and you might wonder, well, why isn't there photographs of other areas? Well, a lot of the business that was happening and things that people were taking photographs that have survived and been collected happen to be from this area. Now, this is the west side of King Street, looking towards the northwest. The buildings right in front of us in the middle are no longer there and are occupied by an office tower on the north side of King Street West, right across from the Michael Starr building. The building on the far left is the King Street Chambers, which is now was called Oshawa House before then, is now called Oshawa House again. And the building is there and has been there since the 1830s. It's one of the oldest buildings in Oshawa. The street in front, of course, is King Street, and the intersection you see on the left in front of the Oshawa Chambers, or the King Street Chambers, is Center Street, then called Church Street. Now, a 1928 snapshot of the types of businesses that existed, where people would have been shopping, because they're all working in these factories. And of course, they have places to spend their money. And the more people who come to the area to get these jobs will be spending their money in the community. So a lot of these businesses grew over time. And this is just a snapshot of 1928 from looking at the city directory. Again, these directories we have in the library, and we've digitized, and you can search online through our website. And if you're interested, I'll include that in an email to you as a follow-up after this. When I send the recording to you of this, I will also send a list of resources if you're interested in exploring the history of the city, or the history maybe of your family in the city. So the 12 grocers, bakeries, dairies, drugstores, lots of garages, doctors. You'll notice there is a library, bowling alley, lots of taxi companies and pool halls and restaurants. And this only grew over time. And this is just there's lots of other businesses that that existed, but these are some of the ones where the citizens would have been spending their money. On the side, you'll see an ad for Todds Bread in Oshawa, which was an institution for many years. And there's a kind of a grainy photograph there on the top. This appeared in the Ontario Reformer newspaper. Now, some of these businesses, of course, here's Todds Bakery. This is actually during a parade. They had a float in the parade to Todds Bakery, and their called their nut bread, I think they advertised. So they've got these little kids sitting up here, and part of their ad was always this little girl holding the bread. So they had actual girls sitting on the float, and this little banner across the top. This is a delivery wagon that they had in 1923. And this, of course, is the milk wagon for Oshawa Dairy, originally owned by the Hart family and called the Hart Dairy. They built a new factory in Oshawa in 1927. This image is courtesy of the Robert McLaughlin, sorry, the gallery, Robert McLaughlin Gallery, Thomas Boakley collection. At this time, this is in the late, actually this is in the early 30s. I couldn't find a photograph from the mid to late 20s, but in the 30s even, deliveries were still happening mostly by horse and buggy, or horse and carriage. But in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, they expanded into trucks. And in this case, this Oshawa Dairy van was from the 1960s. Now, I remember my father living in South Oshawa on Frank Street by the A.G. Simpson plant, saying that they used to get milk delivered in the 60s when he was a kid, milk and butter and cheese. So I do remember, he does remember that, and it did happen into the modern era. So you might think of home delivery as being a thing, a more modern thing now. Well, it happened back then. You got to think as well, not everybody, even though there were lots of cars on the market, not everybody could get out and didn't have a car to go and pick things up. And oftentimes the shopping that they were doing was very specialized. You didn't go to a massive store and where everything was included. You bought your dairy one place, your bread another place, your meat another place, with specialists, sort of specialty shops. Now, there were general grocery stores that existed, but in the case of, oftentimes they would have canned goods and vegetables, and they weren't carrying your bread and dairy or your meat. They were specifically just grocery. The butcher shop, as I mentioned, this is actually a quite busy and packed looking butcher shop with these looks like these poor turkeys laying on the counter. This is shortly before Christmas, I believe. Packing up and getting ready for the shop. You will notice on the ground in this shop, there is sawdust because it is an active butcher shop, and they were, with the birds there as well. It would have been kind of a messy situation, I think, to clean up. And so butcher shops back then looked very different than the ones you would see today, where they have their wares all on display, whereas now they're all hidden in the back and they come out in nice, neat little packages. This is a snapshot from 1925 of what it would have cost the average person living in Oshawa at that time, what things would have cost, the price of food. And this is for a family of 4 people, what it would have cost a family to live in the city. So you see the top 2/3 really, all of the prices in cents. On the right hand side, it lists how many cents each of those things cost. And then down the bottom, you can see how much it costs for steam laundry, the coal to heat their house, and gas and electricity, and their rent, of course, where they paid a quarter month's rent is what they've divided up here. So you can see that a grand total for the monthly cost would have been $23.17. And you must realize they didn't have a telephone bill here either. So this family did not have a phone. Now, of course, besides buying food, of course, there were other things to be bought, specifically jewelers. This is the Felt Brothers Jewelry, which was on Simcoe Street, as most businesses were at that time, either on Simcoe or King. You can see the Tiffany lamp on the counter, and oftentimes these shops as well, if you can see, a lot of the shops in downtown Oshawa had metal ceilings, which were produced by the Peddler factory. So a lot of them gave their business to Peddler to upgrade their ceilings to be very decorative. Again, another ceiling you can see done by Peddler, very decorative ceiling. This is Durian Level, which is Level Drugs, which still exists at the same location on King Street, just east of the Four Corners on the north side. At this time, when I grabbed this photograph, this is from the 1920s. The headline at the top, Durian Level, I took from a 1924 paper where it was advertising the city, Oshawa becoming a city. And there was lots of, in that paper, all the businesses that existed at the time did a little summary of their own business and why it was amazing to be in a community like Oshawa that was becoming a city and was thriving. So that's an interesting paper to look at. And I'll include a link to that in the email that I send out to you later. Another jewelers, Bassett's Jewelers. This is actually the southeast corner of King Street and Simcoe, so the Four Corners. Originally, this was a royal bank, and in thought I had the year there, 1926. So south of corner of Simcoe and King, 1926, Bassett Jewelers opened. You can see the lady here kind of looking in the window in wearing 1920s clothing. A few years after this, I think into the late 30s or maybe early 40s, the Laura Secord actually took the corner of this, and the Bassett Jewelers kind of existed as a wrapping around right at the corner of the building at the doorway was a very small Laura Secord shop, which those from Oshawa might remember. Now they're renovating this building. This building is still there, and there's a lot of a painted mural in front of it at the moment. I take the bus right where this lady is standing. So it's kind of interesting to see that this building is still there and they're doing new things with it rather than tearing it down and building something else. An Oshawa institution, Ward and Dooland. Most people would be familiar with Ward's Dry Goods or Ward's Draperies. This was where they were located at the corner of Athol and Simcoe, the northeast corner. And the inside of Ward's Draperies. I actually bought my drapes at Ward's in 2005, not at this location. They had moved around the corner, kind of up on King Street, 33 King Street East, up until about 10 years ago when they closed. So it's a long-standing institution in Oshawa. This is where people would go to get all of their fabrics. At this time, a lot of people would have been making their own clothing based on dress patterns. So the fabrics were very important. This is an interesting ad that they had for the Veterans Shoe Store. This was in the 1920s. And you'll notice at the bottom it says, private chairs for ladies. So it's a shoe shine, rather, not a shoe store. And there's lots of magazines. I believe there's a barber shop in the back, magazines to be had, and women could come in and sit, but they had separate seats for ladies, which I thought was kind of interesting. And this is a business that existed in the back of the Grand Theater on King Street, and was owned at least in part, by the Boakley family, which later became Mike's at a different location. Oop, I went backwards. This was actually a barber shop on King Street, and I haven't recorded the name of it, unfortunately. Atkinson's, I think, was the butcher. I think I've lost the name of that one in my notes. Okay, I'm going to move on to the entertainment, what people were doing at the time in the 1920s, of course, the radio. And to find out what was on the radio, you had to consult the newspaper. Newspaper of the time would have the radio program showing what was being played at certain times of the day. And a lot of these stations they were getting were from various places in the US. nothing, you know, we got here Tulsa, Washington, Richmond, Detroit. And those were often stations that were rebroadcast from places south of the border. And this actually had a great influence on people's entertainment and their interest in American pop culture at the time, what they would call celebrity, and radio programs. And this is the beginnings of where they discovered that nobody wanted to listen to Canadian programming. They were always listening to American, which led to them coming up with guidelines for making sure that a certain amount of content on Canadian radio is actually Canadian content. So Radio Shop put an ad in the newspaper in the 1920s saying, "Are you in the air yet? Are you enjoying the most fascinating of modern inventions?" So it's about buying a radio. It calls it the cleanest form of entertainment. Radio allows you limitless variety of your choice, and you don't have to go out of your home for it. So look at how expensive these were, $50 to $150. And even the $50 model would set guaranteed 500 miles you could receive broadcasts from those areas. And that $50, that's even expensive considering how much everything else in that in the daily budget that I showed you, how much things cost. And for a radio to cost that much, it's very significant. Now, for those wanting to go further afield, of course, there were the theaters, namely the two larger ones, the Regent Theater on King Street, which still stands today. This photograph is from the it was built in 1919, but was, of course, very popular throughout the 1920s, showing film and some musical acts. As well, the New Martin Theater, which I don't have a photograph of, it eventually became the Marx Theater. Ernie Marx bought the New Martin Theater in 1927. It was a theater before that. Very popular for vaudeville, photoplays, and road shows, and transitioned into showing films. And this is an ad on the left-hand side of a vaudeville show that was coming to the New Martin Theater in 1922. So these were entertainments that could be had outside of the home. Now, of course, nothing, you have to, of course, talk about the history of the Jubilee Pavilion. The pavilions at the lake, there were multiple ones. The only one that survives is the Jubilee Pavilion. And it opened in 1927 to, and of course, it is named the Jubilee Pavilion to celebrate the Jubilee anniversary of Canada. So, as I mentioned, one constant in Lakeview Park has been the pavilions. Today, the Jubilee Pavilion still stands, opened in 1927 and named in honor of Canada's Diamond Jubilee Anniversary of Confederation. Barnhart's Pavilion, which I haven't included a photograph here, was located a little bit further east where the parking lot currently is now, near the beach. And people were always going to Lake even early on. And this is where the Oshawa Railway would take people, sort of holiday goers, would get away from the downtown area, and they would take the train down to the lake. And there were cottages as well, which existed well into recent times. There were cottages, but oftentimes we think of it strangely today, thinking people would go away, much like we would go to the cottage now. People would go to Oshawa Lake and spend time there. And in Lakeview Park, the land was given to the city by R.S. McLaughlin with the promise that it would never be developed into anything else but a public park. So we have him to thank for that. And lots of entertainments would happen at the pavilion, dances and traveling entertainment. For more outdoor entertainment, Alexander Park was often the site of, in this case, a fair. It was happening in the early 1920s. I believe actually this might be 1919 or 1920. Alexander Park having, and the advertisements that I located were, this is the annual fair, South Ontario Agricultural Society. So you'd have all sorts of, much think about the Royal Winter Fair and the Agricultural Fair. But this one also had musical entertainment. They had a bandstand set up. They had a midway and livestock and even a baby show in the fall of, this was 1923. And another advertisement for that fair week in September. You can see an artist's rendition of what's happening. And in the background, between, right below the word week, you can see this is part of the Alexandra Park tower there, which is very distinctive, which no longer stands now. Now, during the 1920s, there was a huge building boom as well. So actually, this building, the Bank of Commerce, was built in 1920. The previous photograph shows it under construction and a sign out front saying this building is being erected by the Canadian Bank of Commerce. The building still stands. It is no longer the Bank of Commerce. It was for a number of years a jewelry store, and then something called Tribal Voices, and now they're renovating it into something else. So this is on the west side of Simcoe Street, just below Bond. The building is still there. If you go to visit it or even check out your Google Street View, you can see where the building is, and even the distinctive markings of the brick are still there. Peddler People was built, as I mentioned, in 1920, the giant factory in the south end of the city. So it's part of the building boom as well. Lots of construction happening. St. Georges Anglican Church, built in 1922. This is still standing. This is, again, an artist's drawing of it. Says here, the new Anglican Church on Center Street. It was St. George's Anglican, moved up from just a block south, across from the current EA level school. And speaking of EA level school, it sits across from Memorial Park now. It is still there today. It's called EA level. It's a continuing education school, but it looks still much like this today. And it replaced the Center Street School, which was on the same site. Much larger schools were built at the time. Now, hospital expansion occurred 1923 to 1925. So you can see the cars here. They help us to date photographs as well. And a lot of the expansion that was built was funded by the McLaughlin family. Oshawa Dairy built a new factory on South Simcoe Street, 431 Simcoe Street South. It is no longer there. It's a strip mall now, just south of where the Tim Hortons is, just below the train tracks. And the building, once it was completed, looked like this. It was 1927. You can see these are all the delivery for Oshawa Dairy from their new building, which was built that year. A very stunning building at the time when it was built, Alger office building, built in 1928 on King Street East, just across from the Genash Hotel. It is still there. So you can see the distinctive markings of it. I believe there are some restaurants in the lower level, and there are apartments and offices above. This is sort of a very 20s looking drawing that I found in the back of an advertisement from the 1928. The Masonic Lodge, right across from the library here on Center Street, is still there. This is the architect's drawing of it being built in 1929. It is still there, looks much the same as it does in this architect's drawing. And of course, the Genash Hotel, built in 1929, a very, at the time, modern and fashionable hotel. Lots of events would happen there. Ars McLaughlin would host dignitaries there. There was a ballroom and pardon me, lots of weddings would take place there as well. So it was very much a fancy hotel of the time. And because it was right on King Street, it was advertised as being, you know, right between Toronto and Montreal. So you can stop on your way and stay at the Genash Hotel. Incidentally, the name Genasha is, of course, General Motors and Oshawa put together, the Genash Hotel. Those of us from Oshawa shorten it to Genash, but it have recently been renovated and into apartments, and it is looking much like it does now in this photograph. You can see a car at the lower right and pulling up to what is the currently what was after this, the motor sales. It's a garage at this time. And down the street on the left, you can see the tower of the post office. Of course, these are kids in 1923 at King Street School, which is no longer there. It was built before that, but this is them sitting in a classroom in paying attention, and of course the teacher's standing at the back. Classrooms look much the same recently, not now, of course, kids being more spaced out, but a lot has changed. Kids sitting at individual desks here. There was what they called a college, which is a school for girls, which existed, Simcoe and Gibb, on the site of what is now the building where it was Central Collegiate High School is now called Durham Alternative Secondary School. This building was torn down to build Central Collegiate. At the time, the children that went there, it was a church school, and was developed initially for men of means and wealth to send their daughters for proper education, which included sewing, dancing, languages, but no math or science at the time. Of course, Oshawa's Hospital had a nursing school. This is one of the early graduating classes from the mid-1920s. And Oshawa's nursing school survived in Oshawa up until the early 1970s, when Durham College opened and it began to educate nurses there instead. So as I mentioned, this is by no means a comprehensive view of Oshawa. It's just a handful of things that give you a view of what Oshawa may have been like living through the bustling period of the Roaring Twenties. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to stop the recording, and people can ask questions if they have them. I will open up your microphones in just a moment.